Today we are quite rightly considering issues around the funding of the WA Police Force and the Department of Justice. And I thank the Honourable Dr Brian Walker for drawing these important issues to our attention and providing us with the opportunity to discuss it today. I note the contributions we've had from the government today, and I would be so bold as to say that none on this side of the chamber would not welcome the commitments and the funding and the projects that are being pursued. But the question that we're really looking at today is not so much about what is being done, but the gaps where more needs to be done. And there are two important limbs to the motion put forward today. We've heard a lot about issues in the area of funding for police, and I will be focusing a little bit more on the Department of Justice side. There's massive amounts of information I could go through in relation to the state of our court systems at the moment, but for today I will focus more on our corrective services and our prisons. Now, I do get this deep sense of disappointment from the government that we over on this side are not giving you a great round of applause for all of the commitments that you've been extolling, the virtues that you've been extolling for us today, the waxing lyrical about all the projects that you have on the go or commitments to. But that's not our job. Our job is to raise concerns of the community about the gaps that are not being addressed. We expect excellence from the government, and that is what we are calling for in this space. Now, as the Honourable Neil Thompson said, it's not just about commitments to funding. The delivery aspect is also what is critical here. And so, in addition to that, the Honourable Dr Brian Walker also spoke not just about funding, but actually about the outcomes for justice. This means we're actually focused more broadly on the effectiveness of the policies that are put forward. We're looking at the value for money of the investments that are being made and looking at what the results actually are in the community. We are hearing directly from people about the crisis conditions that they are dealing with, and that is why we're raising issues here today. Now, the heart of this motion is about public trust. Western Australians expect that our justice system and our police force will be adequately resourced. We expect that when someone is placed into custody, they will be kept in safe, decent conditions, especially as they may not yet have had the opportunity to go to trial and they may not end up being convicted. We expect that when people are released, they have had the support needed so that they are less likely, not more likely, to reoffend. We expect our police officers and our prison staff to be safe at work. And right now, these reasonable expectations are not being met to the standard that we expect. Now, it's not politically popular to draw attention to funding of prisons, but it is a necessary issue to deal with today, because the WA prison system is facing an escalating crisis of underfunding, understaffing, overcrowding, and the actual outcome of all of these issues is significant impacts on safety, on human dignity, and on rehabilitation outcomes. In 2023, the Public Administration Committee released a report number 38, detailing its consultation with statutory office holders. One of the statutory office holders that the committee consults with is the Inspector of Custodial Services. Now, the role of the inspector is to inspect all prisons, detention centres, court custody centres and prescribed lockups in Western Australia every year. The inspector releases reports and also every 3 years a report on each of the prisons and interim reports where needed as well. And the focus of the last committee report was specifically on Banksia Hill Youth Detention Centre, Melaleuca Women's Prison, Bandiat Women's Prison, and on the mental health services in general for prisoners. The findings of those reports, the outcomes that are being highlighted and raised by the inspector are that there are chronic staffing shortages across custodial services with serious consequences for prisoner welfare, including prolonged confinement, which means reduced out-of-cell hours, curtailed access to education with limited access to programs, and insufficient rehabilitation opportunities. The committee, in its review of annual reports, highlighted specifically at Banksia Hill, where our youth are, that the inspector's findings were some of the most shocking we have ever seen in Western Australia. It was declared not fit for purpose. Between January and November 2021, detainees at Banksia Hill attempted suicide on 24 occasions. In July 2022, more than 100 of the 260 cells were found to have been seriously damaged, and more than 30 were unfit for use. Staffing shortages were highlighted. In November 2021, the ISU was understaffed on 17 out of 30 days, and on one day it was short 6 of the normally 10 staff members required. The resignation levels have been high, and the outcome, the commentary made on this is that a failure to radically shift the operations of the ISU will risk a continued deterioration of conditions for both detainees and staff, creating an environment not conducive to rehabilitation. Similar issues were raised in the women's prisons. Specifically, Melaleuca Women's Prison lacks sufficient infrastructure to operate as a fully functioning prison. Bandiat Women's Prison is overcrowded with many facilities too small or no longer fit for purpose. In 2022, the Supreme Court made a declaration that there was a detainee who was locked in his cell for extended periods, had been unlawfully confined. For over 26 days, he was locked in his cell for more than 20 hours per day, and the Children's Court of WA warned that by continuing to use lockdowns, the state government was ignoring the Supreme Court declaration and therefore risked being found in contempt of court. The highest court in our state had to step in and make this declaration. The Children's Court had to step in. As a follow-up from the reports made at this time that the Public Administration Committee reviewed, the Office of the Inspector of Custodial Services released its annual report, the 2023-24 annual report, and the news has not improved. Continually making comments, findings that there are overcrowding, chronic staff shortages, and deteriorating prison conditions that have now become entrenched and systemic across the custodial system. This is clear evidence that government promises of reform have not been matched with the necessary resourcing. Issues such as increasingly finding prisoners sleeping on mattresses on the floor in double cells, cramped conditions, increasing occurrences of self-harm, and so many further issues. In 2025, in January earlier this year, the Inspector of Custodial Services also did a report specifically and more generally into raising concerns around mental health in a report titled People in Custody Requiring Crisis Care. In that report, the inspector found that the clinical and custodial staff we saw working in crisis care centres were doing their best to provide adequate care for prisoners in crisis, but they struggled with inadequate resources and unsuitable infrastructure. They continue to say that crisis care units are under pressure to meet demand, and that the experience for people placed in crisis care has been described as bleak because the resources are not sufficient to deal with all cases of mental health concern. Only those who are at most at risk are able to get some help. The experience of prisoners in crisis care was one of isolation and loneliness, and likely exacerbated rather than improved mental health outcomes. Further to the findings of these reports, which have been released over the past few years, we've had a plethora of articles just in the last month around the state of our prison system, with particular concerns raised around Hakea. In an article on the 20th of July, WA's prison boom as last resort measures put hundreds on the floor. The government confirmed 388 inmates were sleeping on the floor in June, Hakea Prison is the most overcrowded, and these are not all convicted criminals. Some of these people are still awaiting their trial, still awaiting their day in court. The Inspector for Custodial Services, Eamon Ryan, warned in April that substandard conditions at Hakea were in breach of international standards known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, and issued a show cause notice after a visit in May last year. The prison system in WA is operating at 94% capacity most days, up from 82% in 2018, and we've not seen the measures required to deal with this. The riot, the breakout at West Kimberley Regional Prison, the riots, the issues there have all been linked back by those on the ground to issues with overcrowding. The worsening conditions, as the WA Police Office Union Secretary Andy Smith said, are putting entire communities at risk. He said, "The community is in danger, especially in these regional areas, where if our officers hadn't gone in and quelled what was rapidly increasing in veracity, we would have seen people escape into the community, and then it becomes a danger to everybody. We were lucky that our staff didn't sustain any injuries. However, on the Friday and Saturday, there were some serious assaults on our members at the prison, unrelated to the riot." That prison is supposed to give Kimberley prisoners a chance at rehabilitation on country, but it's been described as overcrowded, crumbling, and on the edge of collapse. Now, the Inspector of Custodial Services has called for a formal inquiry into the operations of Hakea Prison. That's how bad it is. It's not enough to simply report and highlight the issues. Concerns that his issues are not being addressed, that these flagged issues are not being dealt with properly, has forced him to call for a formal inquiry, which the government has refused. The recommendation was made in the vain hope that the escalation in the scale of response to the problem would prompt further action. But Corrective Services Minister Paul Papalia confirmed to the West that the government had rejected the recommendation and wouldn't hold an inquiry. So we go back to the real heart of this motion, which is about public trust in the capacity, the funding, the capabilities of our institutions to do the jobs that they are there to do. And I would like to commend the government on its words to say that they actually do support the motion. They do support the notion that the agencies should be funded in a way that allows them to do their jobs in a manner which meets the perfectly reasonable expectations of the West Australian public, but it appears that that is not the case today.